Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another one of the sessions in our series looking at the chapters from Evolution of a Field, Personal Histories and Conflict Resolution. I am delighted that today we are hosting my good friend, Ian Macduff, and I know this is going to be a rich conversation that goes in a zillion different directions. And I'm going to try and get out of the way as quickly as I can so that I can open the floor to all of you, because I'm sure that'll make things even more interesting. But I'm not gonna spend a lot of time going through Ian's incredible resume and all of his achievements. I know you all had a chance to look at his chapter, but I will say Ian is a true gentleman, and he really embodies a lot of the values of our field. And I've really valued our collaborations, particularly on online dispute resolution over the last, gosh, I don't know, 10, 15, even maybe more than that years.
Ian, more like 20 now, Colin.
20 now, I know, gosh.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for making the time. And thank you everyone for dialing in a little bit later than we normally dial in. And Amir, thank you for staying up so late, but we're accommodating global time zones this time. So Ian, let's kick off the conversation.
Sure.
First of all, I love your chapter so much. It's almost difficult to figure out where to start, but I think the place where I would like to start is this great Maori proverb that you start out with. And you say, it actually is the people you met along the way who were your path. And I'm not going to attempt the Maori. I don't know, maybe you could read it. But I love the truth of this. What is the most important thing in the world? It is the people. It is the people. It is the people. I love that saying. Can you say a minute, where did you first encounter this saying? And why did you choose it?
I really couldn't say where I first encountered it. It's part of the air that we breathe. I mean, it's to the extent that the Maori language and Maori culture are very increasingly a part of our world here. That's just one of the very familiar sayings. And although there's a slight diversion here, that itself is a topic for conversation about conflict in terms of the resurgence, the renaissance, which is not a very Maori word, of the Maori language, to the extent that there are now some who are objecting to our radio broadcasters giving greetings in Maori. New Zealand is now increasingly referred to as Aotearoa New Zealand. And Hamilton, a nearby town, is called Kirikiriroa, not Hamilton, because Hamilton is the name of a British Army captain, I think, who was involved in the sacking of the town during the land wars. Wow. Yeah. So the Maori language, Maori culture, it's what is unique to New Zealand. So that expression has been around for a long time.
Well, and I actually want to come back and talk about this. I feel in my visits to New Zealand, I feel like New Zealand is farthest along in sort of understanding that origin story of the nation as preceding the arrival of the colonists. And I think the United States were wrestling with some of this, Canada were wrestling with some of this, Australia is wrestling with this, but New Zealand to me seems the farthest along in sort of thinking about a better future that sort of integrates the full history of the land and doesn't just start it when the white people arrived. And that may be, please.
Well, again, this might be a diversion from our conversation, and I'd be cautious about overclaiming that. I mean, as someone living here, yes, I'd say we've done better than Australia. Canada has done a great job, although recent discoveries of bodies of children indicates they didn't do a great job. So to the extent that there is very strong Maori representation in politics, there are Maori seats in Parliament. The Maori language there are schools which exclusively teach in Maori, and there's such a resurgence of the language now that it is almost impossible to get into Maori language classes. So, when I say we, I mean the country is doing well. But that's not a reason for complacency.
Absolutely.
And there's the kind of backlash. There's always that undercurrent that says Maori is kind of an incidental culture, and we wouldn't be where we are without European colonization. In fact, an opposition politician popped up on the news a month or so ago, basically saying Maori history is irrelevant to where New Zealand has been. It's all about the colonialists. He got happily roasted for that, but nevertheless, that view is still there.
Well, and I remember when you hosted us all in Auckland for the online dispute resolution meeting, you brought in a Maori representative to sort of welcome us, and I think I at least would like to see more of that in the United States. I think I think that it's not a short journey to get to where we need to go, but I think when I go to New Zealand, I'm inspired by a lot of the progress that's been made, at least that I perceive as an outsider.
And as I say, there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, that what you saw in 2018 for the ODR conference is now absolutely standard. At any public gathering or conference, there will always be a mihi or a welcome in Maori. What you were saved from, and others might be grateful for this, that we saved from today, is it often begins with a waiata or a song. So, I promise not to break into song right now. Where's my guitar? Just a minute.
I was about to say, that would be a feature, not a bug, my friends, to have you sing at the beginning. But count it. Well, this may be a topic that we return to as well, because I do feel like this, when we think about the work yet to do, I think this is an interesting roadmap. But it is an interesting segue into, there are three elements that you cite at the beginning of your chapter that sort of were formative for you. And I'd like to talk through each individually, but the first one that you name is actually anthropology, inspired by your sister's studies and, sort of some of the texts that you encountered along the way. And I was wondering if you could just talk about how that shaped your early introduction to the field and the way you think about conflict resolution work, your initial fascination with anthropological studies.
Initial and continuing. I mean, it's something that it remains a career path that I haven't quite followed yet, and I'm only young, so I could probably still go in that direction.
Sure.
And given that I haven't quite retired yet or never will, if I could, I have the same problem, I think, that Howard had in his chat with you, which is, reading our histories backwards, it's always possible to give a greater degree of coherence to them than they in fact had going forwards.
Like your Kierkegaard quote, you have to live it forward and backward.
And I just aware that really before now my late sister, she went to university in Auckland a year before I did, and she was going to study law too, and she went off in other directions. And there were these anthropology texts lying around the house, which was simply a hell of a lot more interesting than the first year law texts that I was required to read. And anyone who's done first year law knows that actually reading the telephone directory is probably more interesting than reading first year law texts. And part also is that because I wasn't born in New Zealand, I was born in what was then Malaya, the Federated States of Malaya. I'm aware of living in and around other cultures. My parents spoke Malay. I mean, they were of British origin, but they met and worked in Malaya before the war, and then returned there after the war, having both been prisoners of war. So I'm just interested in other ways of making the world work. And but also, I come from a very conventional Anglo-Scots Irish family, and just with anthropology, just always held this little possibility of other kinds of lives. It's a little window into other worlds, and I remain intrigued by that.
My thesis advisor, undergrad, when I wrote my thesis on conflict resolution, he was an anthropologist, and he made me read some of these older anthropology texts. And it was interesting. Some of the sections that he gave me almost seemed like conflict resolution training manuals. I mean, it was amazing the degree to which, and these were written in the 30s, 40s, and 50s before there really was sort of a systematic science of conflict resolution as it later emerged in the West. So it really is interesting, the subtlety and the nuance with which anthropologists tackled the topic. I mean, I know you say, some of the the primary treatise in anthropology sometimes could be at best paternalistic and at worst plain racist, and there was some of that as well.
Oh, yes.
It was a product of its age, but it did treat the idea of how conflict could be handled within a society with some nuance and sophistication previous to the law tackling the idea of conflict resolution.
But isn't there also a kind of meta level to that? I mean, if I think about what your comment on the anthropology text, there's another level at which the anthropologists are also not just studying other societies, but studying their own mode of studying.
That is right.
And they're questioning as we go through cycles of, it's not intellectual fashion, but intellectual, revisiting, and we don't want to do too much rewriting of history, but what I think still intrigues me about that work, and it links into the critical phase in legal studies, critical feminism, critical race theory, which doesn't have a best press in the US at the moment.
Oh yeah.
There's another topic for 4 or 5 hours conversation, but it's a way of stepping back from the work you're doing to reflect on how you're doing your own work, to think about yourself as someone who's intervening in and observing. And it's a kind of Hawthorne effect as well. I mean, as when I observe something, I change it.
Yeah.
So, and we know that from the kind of work of Malinowski and the anthropologists, is that what they were perceiving was their view of the world. And there was a lovely issue, I don't know if any of you read, of Margaret Mead's book, Coming of Age in Samoa.
I haven't read it.
And it was an astonishing piece of work in terms of her study of the much more liberate. It was a part of the ongoing debate about nature and nurture, and what she looked at was and commented on was the much freer lives of the young people in Samoa and their early exploration of their sexuality and their sexual relationships, and so it was a liberating and liberated sort of book. All well and good until a later anthropologist, an Australian whose name escapes me at the moment, did a study of that book and realized it was all nonsense. It wasn't fake news, but basically what it was the people who told her about their lives told her what they thought she wanted to know.
Oh, interesting.
And she, as a 20-something anthropologist, was too naive to know that was the problem. So, Coming of Age in Samoa was a methodological problem, and her insights were a reflection of the way in which her presence gave her the answers that her people thought she wanted.
Fascinating. Well, and I remember one of my early professors in conflict resolution. He introduced me to Chris Argyris and Dan Schoen and action science and reflective practice. And he talked about when you mediate, it's like looking through a mirror at night. You can see what's through. I'm looking through a window at night. You can see what's on the other side of the window, but you can also see a reflection of yourself. And it seems to me that some of the early anthropologists, they were doing that same thing. They had to watch, but they also had to watch themselves watching, because you could easily project some of your own assumptions about the why, but you have to really listen to, you have to get the why from your subject as opposed to you in your head saying, oh, this must be why they're doing that. So
there's a lovely comment to that effect. And I can't remember who said it, about the standard Dogon family, Dogon in Central Africa.
Right.
The standard structure of a Dogon family is father, mother, 2 children, and a French anthropologist.
I love that. That.
They basically embedded themselves in those families, and
I would say I think my family could have been improved by the presence of a French anthropologist growing up. So I don't want to judge anybody's family structure. This is a good transition. I'm going to jump over your middle thing because we can come back to it. But I want you to talk a little bit about humanistic legal education and sort of how your pursuit of this opened some of the doors and windows to conflict resolution practice, because it seems like that was the development of that was contemporaneous with kind of your development as a legal scholar as well.
And in a way, I can start that with a question to all of you as well, which is to ask, and maybe for later comment, the extent to which your own pathway begins with a sense of discontent and not being quite comfortable with what you were doing, the path you were on, the profession you were on, and it's not a great confession to say I went into law. My father was a lawyer. I thought, that's what you do. But ended up in legal academia after some time practice and some time as a probation officer in South London, which was a growing up period. Becoming a probation officer, working with people who were sent to us because no one else could work with them. They were just too violent, too dangerous, too drug-riddled. And academic life seemed much safer than that. And in the 60s and 70s, not quite as drug-riddled. But what led me to exploring or discovering the humanistic legal education was the emerging cross currents in legal education, the emergence of critical legal studies, critical feminism, etc., and an awareness that, it's one of the comments I make in the chapter, that I and others were becoming aware that the study of law was perfectly possible without studying what it was that law was about. And we could spend our time studying, and the traditions of British analytical jurisprudence were still very strong, that what you studied was the law, pure and simple.
Right. The law.
And what sort of got me into that, I suppose, first of all, was studying criminology in my second year at law school, I think, and realizing that studying what crime was about, what criminal law was supposed to address, was actually giving me the context, which law itself never had. So all the studies of contract never told you anything about commercial dealings or how people engaged in contract, etc., right across the whole curriculum. And so the humanistic legal education stuff, which was particularly with Jack Himmelstein, who was then in New York, and Liz Dworkin, also in New York, was a way of drawing on the work of humanistic traditions in psychotherapy and the person-centered traditions, and recognizing that there were, this may come as a great surprise to some lawyers, there were human beings at the heart of law, and human beings at the heart of legal study. And it's just started that switch in focus. And I spent some time with Jack and Liz, and then which is part of it's the people story, and got passed around that group across the states. And for myself, I think that's true. I was on sabbatical. It might have been 1980 or thereabouts. And I also went up to visit the then dean at Harvard Law School because I was a faculty member at Auckland. And I thought, as a courtesy matter, I'll go and talk to the dean at Harvard, whose name escapes me. And he was an absolute cock case, because critical legal studies at that stage was tearing the faculty apart. I don't know if any of you know people like Roberto Unger and so on, but basically the faculty was riven. It was being torn apart, and he sat there looking like a stunned bunny, saying, "What is it you want to talk to me about?" I just came to say hello. That's all. So nothing came from that conversation, other than a sense that this poor man was due to be put out to pasture any time now, because half the faculty left to go to Chicago, and it was just it was a mess. But some of those people were having more fun than they'd ever had in their lives. But they're having more fun tearing things apart than they were putting things together. So Harvard wasn't the place for humanistic legal education, but NYU, Columbia, and on the West Coast, Cal and UCLA, and particularly San Diego, are places where interesting things were going on. I mean, it's also where a very dangerous development was happening in law schools, that law professors were actually talking to faculty members from other faculties.
Interesting.
And they were talking to historians and psychologists and educators, and it was just a revelation for most of us.
Well, and you write at the bottom of page 82, you write that this humanistic legal education was the kind of shift that helped make mediation possible, in that the notions of agency in the worlds of dispute and resolution permitted, even required, the active presence of those whose disputes they were. Yep. In the United States right now, we have a big movement, Black Lives Matter. And one of the watchwords of that movement is nothing about us without us. Don't talk about what those people are doing.
Yep.
Bring us into the room. Like if we're going to be discussed, we want to be a discussant. And and it's interesting, that notion of agency that you call out as coming from humanistic legal education, sort of, like I said, open the door to the way we think about disputes in the conflict resolution field, because it's a question of agency.
Yeah, and that same theme is just emerging here, because the leader of our opposition in Parliament here is doing a bit of not so subtle race baiting about a report on Maori political representation and political participation, which has been a long time coming. And there's been one current Maori MP who is the co-leader of the Maori party in Parliament. There are two MPs in Parliament, and another former MP, saying basically the same thing: talk with us, don't talk about us.
Right.
Because there's a very strong European white convention to talk about how we deal with issues of Maori representation. The Maori saying, excuse us, but we're in the same room.
Right. You give us a seat at the table. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, we're here. And there was a major protest by farmers recently, a week or so ago, who were protesting about environmental matters and the constraints that might be placed on their pollution. And one of the farmer placards was "Stop the land grab," because there's some areas of land to be set aside as unique environmental areas. And so stop the land grab. And one of the Maori commentators saying, we've been saying that for the last 180 years.
That's to say.
But nobody's been listening.
Right.
So, I mean, at least the conversation has some humor to it, but it's got a bite to it.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
Back to your point, though, Colin, is right. It's what these critical and humanistic trends did was to say what we have to talk about and talk with is the people who are at the heart of what is our concern. So if we're talking about constitutional law or human rights or whatever it is, talking about those who are affected by those laws.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I know we're going to come back to talk about some of this, because you address it so deeply in the last section, but I want to touch on the other point that you the base you touch as we move through your sort of foundational influences, and it's travel literature. And I must say that the middle of this section is almost like a syllabus of some of the best travel writing ever. Mark Twain, George Orwell, some of my favorites, William Least Heat Moon, Paul Thoreau. But just you yourself, I think, are kind of a travel writer in your own right. You should be on this list as well. But just speak briefly about why you decided to include this and sort of its influence on the way you think about the work you do. Yeah.
Well, I think I refer to it slightly cynically as anthropology without the footnotes.
Sure.
And what I've gained and still gain from that genre of writing, and it's probably, if I think of the kinds of books that we have on our shelves here, one of the largest sections is that collection. And travel writing is a very broad category, and one of my favorite recent writers is an English writer, Robert Macfarlane, who writes beautifully. I don't know if any of you out there have read Robert Macfarlane, but he actually is a professor of English at Cambridge University, whose specialty area for his doctorate was on 19th century plagiarism, which has absolutely nothing to do with travel writing. But he writes about landscape. And one of the things that I'm coming back to this theme in my own pursuit is how do we think about our connection with the land and with the landscape? And partly because I'm not a native-born New Zealander, and what's important for New Zealanders is the expression is in the Maori word is your tūranga waiwai, the place where you stand. I mean, do you know where your tūranga waiwai is the place where you stand? And one of the key issues in the kind of negotiations and mediations I've been involved with over the years has been land rights and Maori land rights and negotiations between Maori and the government on reparation and return of land. And so the connections there are possibly a little tenuous for those who haven't been inside the skull, but they're about how we look at someone else's land, and as travelers they'll be passing through someone else's landscape, and what we see is not necessarily what they see, and our lived experience is not the same as theirs. But also, as I mentioned in that section, it's some of the finest writing, not I hasten to add I think again I mentioned this, the kind of writing of Peter Mayle, The Year in Provence, which is, I am here, you are not, you poor sap, and I'm having a wonderful time. And also there's a very superior, supercilious form of writing about the native people, and how Peter Mayle writes about the French in Provence is not a good example, but it's also just that in these lockdown times, it's a way of getting out and seeing other worlds.
Well, I think that's true. It's interesting. One of the most popular genres of television in the United States right now are travel shows.
Really?
And I think, there was a chef who recently died, unfortunately, by suicide, Anthony Bourdain.
Oh, yes.
And he had
I
this
love his work.
show, I don't think he holds up in terms of the great writers that you talk about, but he took a very interesting approach in the way that he did his travels. And I think it's kind of like you're talking about. It's like, this is not my land. This is their land. I need to appreciate it from their perspective, not me, an American, going around saying, well, I don't like this. That's not the way we cook it back in New York, And I think it was amazing to me how beloved he was when he passed away, because I think there's a hunger for people to learn about these other places and an appreciation of people that sort of that can bring that sort of eye to it, a non-judgmental eye. Well, okay, I'm going to open it up because we have so many great people on this call. But I want to talk about a few of the latter sections of your chapter to maybe spark that conversation. I was wondering if I could get you to actually read a little bit, Ian, if you wouldn't mind. I don't want to be selfish here and talk too much about online dispute resolution, because I think people know that that's often where I gravitate to. But if you could turn to page 88.
88, can do.
And I was thinking about having you read a shorter section, but maybe a little bit longer would be good. If you could start on that paragraph that starts, one of the enduring features, and then we'll go to the top of the next page and I'll stop you at a certain point. But yeah, can you read that paragraph?
Yeah, our reading today is taken from the book of Mediators, chapter whatever it is, dearly beloved. One of the enduring features and challenges of mediation is that it has fostered, through private dispute resolution, a kind of distributed decision-making. While this has, on the one hand, served the ends of freeing parties to be the authors of their own outcomes, it has also freed them from the normative anchor of legal and constitutional motherships. That relationship and tension between centre and periphery, public and private, formal and informal, substance and process is unlikely to go away anytime soon.
Please, I keep going, because I want. Oh yeah, please. I'm sorry. Keep going till preoccupies me.
Okay. Indeed, it becomes an even greater issue in the world of information technology-based, at times algorithm-driven online dispute resolution, which is the field that, at time of writing, largely preoccupies me.
So I want to talk about this more widely with everybody, because you talked before about the land, and I think it's so interesting. Travel writing is so much about place. Yep. And the thing that's so interesting to me about technology is it's blurring place. I can be interacting with you. We're having this conversation like we're sitting at a table, but you're on the other side of the planet. And I think suddenly it's this whole notion of where I am it's more about where my mind is than where my body is. So, I think it's very interesting when you talk about freed them from the normative anchor of legal and constitutional motherships. I love that. I love that phrase. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit further about that and why it interests you.
I guess typically we'd see legal solutions, solutions to conflicts as being tied to some sort of normative framework, legal, moral, whatever, which in turn are linked to a location. So we talk about the federal or state legal system or a country's legal system. But one of the things that has happened over the last, I guess, 40 years is that because people are drawing on their own resources to resolve their own conflicts without necessarily being tied to what the law requires them to do, albeit there is a broad requirement for legality and legitimacy. That means that what we've got is, I think maybe even mentioned somewhere in here, a a dispute-centered form of dispute resolution. So it's
Mm,
not norm-centered. I have some difficulty with that.
mm,
I'm not entirely happy with that development because it does mean that there's a sense in which people say whatever the parties decide is right for them is ipso facto just, and I don't buy into that
mm,
because there is a sense in which it still needs to be linked to some kind of shared comprehensible normative framework, which I think, if we go back to one of the core texts, I mean, the Fisher and Urey text, one of their requirements is legitimacy, and the outcomes in negotiation or mediation need to be legitimate, which is not just what I think is legitimate, but what is recognized by some sort of external criteria. And I think we haven't quite worked out how to find that balance yet
mm,
in terms
mhm,
of what's good for me is not necessarily the right answer for our community, our collective.
mhm, mhm. Well, it's so interesting because I think the nation state has been such an organizing principle of
Yep.
global society for so long, and I think the internet is undermining the primacy of the nation state. And
Yeah.
I think nation states are wrestling with the fact that they're losing
Yeah.
control of their populace because any of us can pull out a phone, swipe, swipe, swipe. We're communicating with someone on the other side of the planet. You do talk about this notion from Professor Floridi about
Yeah.
distributed morality,
Yeah.
and I'm wondering, is it possible for us to create a new set of norms in this kind of new sphere that we're evolving into, this sort of metaverse? Or is it going to be that the whole notion of shared norms is sort of a quaint artifact? I don't know. But it just make it, yeah,
Nor do I.
please.
Yeah, because I
Yeah.
think one of our risks is even greater degree of fragmentation, and the distributive morality is fine in that it may be inclusive. It allows us to have this conversation wherever we are at whatever time. There's a flexibility in time and place, and time and place somehow collapse, don't they? But to the extent that it unmoors us, unhitches us from the place where we are,
Mhm.
then that creates a risk of fragmentation. So I don't know the answer to your question, Colin, and others may have a view on this. I mean, is it possible, is it desirable to come up with some sort of shared meta morality? Given our current state, I wouldn't be optimistic.
Well, yeah, and that's a great opportunity to see if anyone has any comments.
Yeah.
Please feel free to put a comment in the chat or to use the hand raise
Yeah.
function, which you can get under reactions. You can click raise hand, and then I will
Yeah.
see you, and then you can I can call on you. But does anyone have any comments or questions on this topic or any others that Ian has raised so far? Please feel free to unmute yourself.
And I've just gone over to the second screen on my screen to see we've got some familiar faces out there, familiar names.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think the people who are most likely to throw a challenging question your way are the ones who know you well. So
Yeah, but I suspect also they're the ones who are not showing their faces. Yeah.
that may be as they roll their eyes.
Except for
with
Jim. I'm looking at Jim sitting there looking very content with life and nodding sagely as only Jim can do.
Jim is good at the contented nod. Yes. Any
Yeah,
comments, thoughts, questions?
Jim's unmuted himself, so here goes.
I continue to wonder also as to the role of law in situations, and people can learn so much on their own now. You would think that if they're motivated, they can often find out good and relevant information without necessarily needing to go to a lawyer. And now so many of our transactions, particularly commercial, are international, that you don't even know which law would apply or what jurisdiction you would bring something. And I start thinking about at what price point is it really worth investing in a lawyer to figure out the legality of a difficult situation. And I'm sure there is one, but there's a whole lot of conflicts below that price point where I think people operate by the seat of their pants. And
Sure.
Colin, I think your dream is really that there are not going to be online courts. I mean, there will be,
Right.
I suppose, for those who want to localize it and file and the like. But for most people, they're just disputes to get through. and move on to more important things in their life. And so I really think it is rather interesting as to whether the law is decreasing in its relevance simply because the cost of legal consultation, representation, and appearing in a particular jurisdiction is so enormous. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe a part of ODR is so streamlining things that the ability for people to self-represent will be elevated. I welcome people's thoughts on all those kind of issues.
Can I respond to you, Jim,
Please.
with a couple of thoughts on that? I think you're right in that what we've got with so many international transactions, that jurisdiction, the location of dispute, is an issue. In the international arbitration and certainly in Singapore, where I used to be based, there's a way of dealing with that by having written into contract that the seat of the arbitration and the applicable law will be that of Singapore. So you're resolving that question. But it's another, and we've now moved into Colin's favorite territory in ODR, but it's another question that comes out of this, which is, if where we start in both the mediation field and in the ODR field is a broader concern about access to justice, it's not just about access to law, but now access to technology. And one of the conversations that I'm about to have with someone in our Citizens Advice Bureau is about digital exclusion and or positively digital inclusion. And you mentioned, Jim, the idea of self-representation. The self-represented litigant is the bane of the lives of most of our courts, because they cannot afford lawyers. They turn up unprepared with the wrong documentation. They take up a huge amount of the court admin time, which they have to, because they are entitled to their day in court. But one of the things that certainly is the case here, and it probably wherever you folks find yourselves, is that increasingly a lot of government services, access to benefits payments, access to your tax issues, are now exclusively online. And that becomes a problem in that the people for whom those services are often primarily intended are precisely the population who do not have access to online resources. Mm-hmm. And late 2019, I was at a conference in Wellington, our capital city, a conference hosted by the Department of Internal Affairs on digital exclusion. And one of the presenters there commented on the fact that she's well aware of mothers who are taking their kids down to the local town library at night, so they can sit on the pavement or a seat outside the library under a street light to be able to use the free Wi-Fi from the library at night so the kids could do their homework. Mm-hmm. And so, while we quite rapidly move in the direction of dispensing with locally based legal services, we have to be aware of the cost for other people. And certainly there are people who are part of our wider ODR, ICODR discussion, who are talking about varying abilities in accessing these resources. So you've opened a wee can of worms there, Jim.
Yeah, and let me open one more issue. We tend to think about access to justice, wanting to have a just society, I suppose. Mm-hmm. But even before we started doing our magic 30, 40 years ago with ADR and mediation, 97% of the cases were already settling, half of them on the courthouse steps, within a week of trial. And so I tend to wonder how much of what we do is about access to justice. And of course, we can have more than one purpose to our systems. I think it's more about access to resolution. Mm-hmm. And the opportunity for resolution. And the thing I've noticed is when you get disputants, there's really only one solution that's absolutely unacceptable. And that's the one that the other side is demanding. And that's the benefit of mediation, is that you're able to have, if you will, a face-saving, respectful hopefully optimizing dialogue.
Yeah.
And I wonder if somewhat unconsciously we continue to over-perpetuate and overemphasize the justice part, because it's still 1%, 2%, or 3% that would ever go before an impartial decision maker where justice would be rendered. All of the rest of it is just figuring it out with problem solving settlement discussion. So I wonder sometimes if we have fallen into certain traps and that we continue. Another quick illustration is, when mediations were getting going, how do we structure it? Where do we meet? What kind of room? Where does the mediator sit, et cetera? And it was easy for us to kind of think about hearings, and we wanted respectful dialogue and forums and hearings. And of course, it was all very physical. And it was in the shadow of the law, and we wanted it to be acceptable to the courts, the judiciary, and the attorneys. Well, my gosh, how different are things now? We're clearly talking about issues of access. And I think it's a really interesting question. Access to what exactly? Yeah. So that's I continue to wonder, do we really want to emphasize, I hate to say it, justice, when it's such a small fractional minority that actually are able to present a case for a just decision, which is what I tend to think of. The rest of it is people figuring it out. Your thought,
Ian? Yeah.
Oh, I'm not going to attempt to cover all of that, but just one thought on that, Jim, and I have to agree with you in that the focus on justice, to the extent that it focuses on justice, equals the courts of law. The old symbol of the justice with her sword and scales. But there may also be a more visceral and less organized and formal and legalistic view of what is justice, and maybe that's what people are still after. But you commented earlier on the online courts. I mean, one of the ways in which the UK's move towards the online courts recognizes that only very few cases ever need to make it to court, and the most of them can be assisted in going away by providing better information, better access to documentation, better access to legal resources, the kind of stuff that most folks just simply don't have access to, which can be done through algorithm, can be done by going down to your local library or your Citizens Advice Bureau to simply be informed about what it is the problem. I'm just having an email exchange with a friend in Wellington this morning. Part of the boundary wall between his property and the neighbor's property has collapsed, and it's on a very slopey, hilly section. And part of the question, my question to him was, whose problem is that? Because he's on the uphill side, and it's the wall that's collapsed on the downhill side. Is it the problem of the lower landowner to provide support by way of building a very expensive retaining wall? This is not something you go to court for. I mean, part of my early life in mediation was dealing with rights of way, retaining walls, boundary lines, the sort of stuff that would drive you absolutely bonkers. But it's the stuff that is never going to go to court. But it needs a solution which, as you say, Jim, works for both of the parties, but also is in some way a legitimate solution. Because also, if you decide on building, say, a retaining wall on the boundary, at some point, one or both of those people are going to sell their land and their house. And the title documents need to show a properly constructed wall. Whoops, you've just moved across my screen. I have to chase you across the screen. You're over there now. So I think what we're chasing around here is a broader concept of what it means by access to justice, and it's justice with a small j, maybe with a big one.
The one thing, of course, the courts have historically offered is they do capture the other party's attention. It's kind of glass of ice water in the face, and like, hey, you need to pay attention to this.
Yeah.
and you need to respond. And I don't know that I have an answer for that, other than I suppose by contractual commitments, where
I'm going to shut you up, Jim.
All right.
As much as interesting as I think that is, we're running out of time, and that's a very rich topic that we could absolutely go down that rabbit hole. So I'm only doing that because I love you, Jim. But let me get some other voices in here. Colm, I saw you unmuted for a second. Do you still have a question you'd like to put in?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Colin. This has been really interesting, and I'm from go, but I thought I'd try and throw something in before I go. My apologies. And that is, I mean, the idea, and Ian talked about coming here through different ways, and the kind of multi-dimensional way we look at cross subjects, cross disciplines to bring us here. But I also wonder if, both ODR and the impact of COVID and everything else is also an opportunity for us to, actually move ADR away from the justice system, the courts, and back perhaps where we thought it was 20 years ago when we were looking at it. We're spending a lot of time talking about access to justice, but the reality is that our court system is never going to have the kind of access that we talk about. And plugging 21st century technology on something out of really the late 1800s is never going to make any difference. But maybe there's an opportunity, because certainly in Ontario, where I'm a mediator and arbitrator, because we've some types of mandatory mediation, we found that the whole system, and I'm speaking as a former lawyer, has been co-opted and dragged into the law. Maybe it's an opportunity to pull it back. And that's, I think, also congruent with the idea of the multidisciplinary approach. And with that, just a comment, which may or may not mean anything, but this has been a really fascinating discussion, and appreciate the opportunity to be here. As I said, unfortunately, I have to leave, but thank you for taking my question, Colin.
Thank you, Colin. Good to see you again too. Yeah.
Ian, any thoughts about
that? I'd love to share your optimism, Colin, because one of the concerns that I have is that mediation has been captured, not only here but elsewhere. When I think of the people who are now senior mediators, they're all senior lawyers, or as you probably have in Canada and States, they're retired judges, for whom this is a very good and profitable retirement gig. And so certainly we're not a big country here, but there's probably only, I'd say, no more than half a dozen full-time commercial mediators who are making a living at it, and they're all senior barristers. They're all people who just get the jobs passed around amongst themselves. It's very hard to break into that work. I mean, leave aside the organizational mediators, the people who work in government departments or work for government departments, but the field has been captured, and it may have begun in a subtle way a couple of decades ago when we started looking at mediation standards. And once you start enacting mediation legislation, then you make it a much more of a legal entity. And I don't object to having legal standards, but when the conversation is captured by a particular part of the profession, we do, as you say, Colin, we need to bring in the psychologists, the sociologists, the otherologists, the people whose professions have actually shaped us more than law has. Law has had very little to do with shaping mediation, except as an escape plan. People like you and me, who've moved out of law, and so we kind of look back over our shoulders. One of my sort of on the back burner writing projects is something called Life After Law School. I'm looking at all the people, the artists and the singers and the musicians who have at some stage studied law, Paul Simon, Leonard Cohen, Vasily Kandinsky, et cetera, et cetera. But your point though, Colm, I think is absolutely right, is that it may be time to recover that earlier conversation.
Yeah, my father-in-law is a corporate litigator, and when I first started dating his daughter, and I told him I was interested in mediation, he was like, "Get a real job." And now that he's been essentially forced into retirement, he's like, "Tell me about this mediation thing." So I know all about that. I want to put Tom's point in, and I'll go to Meyer. Tom made an excellent point in the chat. He said, "I think that online mechanisms lead us to the idea that traditional anchors of time, place, and a body of law is replaced by anchoring to people themselves, which leads us ultimately to viewing legal matters as social justice issues, which I think is a very interesting thesis. Tom, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, but I think it's a great point.
Well, unfortunately, I have to. This great conversation. Thanks for putting it together. I was taken too by the metaphor of anchors that Ian wrote about, and I began to think that, well, those things, those anchors have always been time and place, and we know that doesn't matter anymore. And as Jim mentioned, body of law, which may not matter anymore. And then we have our authority, law, psychologist, or whatever, and all of that gets blurred. And maybe we just get back to people solving disputes. And we don't anchor ourselves to these artificial things any longer. And maybe the last 2 years or a year and a half, or however long we've been in this mess, has taught us that it's really a people business. It's not so much a business that's affixed to law, which somehow is connected in here. And I'll leave all of you, because you're all much smarter than I am, is this idea of how does social justice fit into that? Is there such a word as justice? And sometimes our work interferes with that, I think. Can we mediate an environmental dispute where the confidentiality maybe impacts a stakeholder that's not in the conversation and doesn't resolve, it maybe creates another issue because of the confidentiality of it. So I think there's a lot going on here. I'm going to be quiet and let all of you smart people shed more light on it.
And before I go to Meyer, I want to bring in Bob's point, because it's related to this. He wrote in the chat, the Greeks looked upon justice as virtue in action, and therefore a virtue. The Greek conception of justice was the virtue of soul, and injustice its vice. To both Plato and Aristotle, justice meant goodness, as well as willingness to obey laws. And I will say, my friend Jan Martinez, in her book on dispute systems design, she talks about justice, and she defines 12 different kinds of justice. Some of them being procedural justice, some of it being outcome-based justice, some of it's being rights-based justice. So it almost feels, I mean, Bob took it back to the Greeks. It almost feels like a philosophical concept as opposed to something concrete. It gets back to what Jim's saying. Maybe we're in the resolutions business, and justice is a bridge too far. So Ian, what do you think about all of that?
Well, I love Bob's comment there, and try and hold on to that, because one of the other hats that I've worn for a number of years is teaching ethics. And for 8 years in Singapore, one of my jobs was teaching ethics to the unwilling, particularly
to the unwilling.
Yes. Got the occasional convert, but not many. But over the course of that, I mean, one of the things that I really valued about teaching ethics was that it helped me clarify what my own ethical stance was. And I think it's one of the things about reading the great philosophers is that it's, or even traveling with the great philosophers, it helps you clarify that. And if I have my own slant at all, it's something that Bob alluded to. It's virtue ethics, and virtue ethics is about how we conduct ourselves, not necessarily with any reference to a prescriptive normative framework, but about what being good means, and what that may mean. It goes back to Jim's earlier comment, whether that means that we are at risk of or have the advantage of being able to disconnect ourselves from our formally prescriptive frameworks. I don't know. I suspect there's going to be a significant amount of nervousness about any suggestion that what matters is just people resolve their own disputes. Because that doesn't, I mean, it's part of something I alluded to about the connection and tension between self and society, between center and periphery. The center cannot hold. I mean, Yeats' poem about when you've got a great disparity and sort of dissolution of social bonds, the center doesn't hold any longer. And I just wonder whether we are part of finding another way of holding, not so much holding the center together, but it's something that Jean-Paul Lederach refers to in his wonderful writing on conflict, is about the metaphor of nets rather than
nets. Right, you talk about that.
Yeah, and what you've got is a network. I mean, it's a metaphor again for us in the ODR business, is that instead of having a center from which everything else emanates, what you've got is the nets, and conflict in John Paul's work in the Pacific and elsewhere is that conflict is a hole in the net. And what you're doing is repairing that net. It's not necessarily to say that there's a single central core to it, but what you're looking at is, if you look at a kind of map of our conversation, what is it that connect, what are the lines that connect us, not to a central place, but to a process, I think, more than anything else.
A system.
Yeah.
Well, Meyer, thank you for your patience. I see your hands up. What would you like to say?
Yes, as you know, I keep coming back to our work that is now expanding quite a bit. So you know that we are a vendor resource for the LA Superior Court, which is the largest unified court system in the world. You know, there's 650 courts, about several hundred judges. There are 85,000 cases a year. We're talking about a huge justice system, and is it working? The court decided to end its ADR program several years ago, and that's when we stepped in and created a nonprofit to fill the gap. But only 2 years ago, the court created what's called the Vendor Resource Program, in which it awarded contracts to our organization, which was a small nonprofit, and JAMS, whom you might have heard of. Anyway, the court then awarded us a contract to do online mediations. We're the only one that offered and have that contract. We have turned out to be a resource center for hundreds of people calling in because they can't find the answers to their, quote, litigated circumstances or pre-litigated circumstances. So we have a panel now of 20 outstanding, experienced senior members of the bar with 20 to 45 years of experience in every field across the board. And they're offering their services at $75 an hour per party. That's about $150 an hour for 3 hours. So we brought it down, the cost down to very minimal. And we even waived those fees for those who can't pay them. So we're actually doing a tremendous job in a resource for all kinds of litigated cases. However, we on our own took on the dispute resolution services of doing unlawful detainers. As you probably know, there's been a moratorium on unlawful detainers throughout the country, and each state and each jurisdiction has a different rules that apply. And the moratorium is coming to an end in September. So we created a new panel of non-lawyer mediators who are experienced within unlawful detainer cases, who've been at the courthouse doing hundreds and hundreds of those cases.
So Meyer, forgive me, I'm just cognizant of the time. If there's a question.
The bottom line is, how do you feel about that kind of resource to provide these kinds of high quality mediation services to any citizen that needs a resolution of a dispute?
These non-lawyer mediators to come in and in lawful detainer. Okay, sure.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, before we began this call, Colin, you showed us your authentic background, not the wonderful view of Vancouver you have. And in the background is a picture of Frank Sander. And Maya, it seems to me that what you're talking about fulfills the promise that Frank Sander raised 45 years ago, which is, well, he then talked about the multi-door courthouse, but it's multi-door access, and what you're offering and what your structure offers is exactly that, it would seem to me. And in a way, the landscape, when Mark Gallanter writes about the landscape of disputes, I mean, I think what we're looking at is the landscape of a number of different platforms where people can find access to resolving their issues. And I mean, it goes back to Jim's earlier point too, that where we need not look at the old court-centered, hierarchical, unicameral way of doing things. So I think that sounds an enormously promising offering.
Thank you.
There's one last comment that I'd like to inject before we break, and that's from Chuck. Chuck said, Chuck. So Ian, what values and interests most motivate and guide us from more individual, single siloed, defined issue resolution to systemic, interdisciplinary, collaborative conflict prevention and management that serve more equal justice for those most undervalued and underserved? Wow. Yeah, Chuck, if you want to elaborate on that? Nope, he doesn't. So wow. What do you think about that, Ian?
That's a great question, and it's something you and I touched on briefly in our preliminary conversation a couple of days ago, Colin. About
That's right.
it's not only a question is why do we have mediation, but why do we mediate? What is it that draws us into this? And as I read your question, Chuck, I was just reminded. I mean, this takes me back a bit. God, I don't know how long ago, but when I was first teaching at Victoria University in Wellington. Not entirely happy in the faculty because it wasn't entirely happy faculty, but there's an older colleague in the education faculty whom I adopted as my mentor. He didn't know that, but he was my wise elder. And I mean, your question prompts me to remember the one thing he said to me when I went and said, "Oh God, this place is just a viper's nest." And he said, "All that matters, Ian, is you keep caring." And maybe that's why we do this, because we keep caring.
I love that. Yeah. Actually, I'd like to end with that last, if you could read one more passage and maybe we can wrap there, Ian. On the bottom of page 90, where that starts, when we think and talk about mediation.
Okay. When we think and talk about mediation, whether as mediators, trainers, or commentators, we probably end up with two kinds of questions. The social, legal, and political question centers on the contributions that mediation can make to access to justice, social peace, efficiency, and economies in justice systems, dispute and autonomy, and responsibility, and so on. The second question is a more personal one. Why do we mediate? Why do we prefer to work this way?
Yeah, let's stop there. I mean, I think that's what you're addressing too, is on the one hand, we feel a resonance to this work because of everything you talk about, the social, legal, and political question. But I think there's also that personal draw. And I think that's kind of what Chuck's question gets to, you know, what values and interests motivate and guide us from where we are to where we need to go, that more holistic vision. So maybe I'll let you take the last word, Ian, sort of on that topic.
I'm not sure that I have a last word other than appreciation to you, Colin, for setting this up. And actually, while he's not there, appreciation to Howard and because Howard and I go back a long way, for inviting me as, I think, the sole Southern Hemisphere representative in the book. And I've just loved reading the book and reading the stories. It's interesting when I read those stories that there's a lot of people whose stories are not represented there. The next volume is Indigenous Mediators. That's the one that needs to be in there. We don't need a volume about the lawyer mediators and the judge mediators. They're perfectly happy as they are. But I was aware when I wrote the essays on mediation, or edited that, which you're aware, Colin, that the next volume needs to be the voices which are not in there. And that's where this brings me to.
Absolutely.
Thank you for the conversation, and thank you, all of you, for joining in.
I feel like we could go another hour easily, but hopefully everyone will join me in a round of applause to thank Ian for this wonderfully thoughtful session.
Thank you.
Thank you for your great work, and thanks for sharing some time with us today. So
very happy to do so. Thank you.
This was a wonderful addition to our pantheon of interviews that we can put into the archive. So a month from now, we'll have another. I'm not exactly sure who it'll be, but it'll be hard to compare to this one. So thank you again, Ian. Take care, everyone. Thank you for sharing some time with us today, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.